Hey friends, here we are. Welcome to Theology and Practice Equip Forums. So I just have to admit what I had in my mind when we dreamed up this great idea to implement this into our Oaks community rhythms. This is not what I had in mind, but thank you for clicking play on the video, actually watching this. But for real, I really am bummed that I'm staring at a camera by myself in our church office tonight and not in a room full with you guys. But we're going to make the best of it, and been praying for you and even praying for this time that this would actually be meaningful and impactful and not just something that I have to work my way through because I just despise preaching to a camera and teaching to a camera, and I know that you don't really enjoy being taught to from a screen. And so these were supposed to be really practical and conversational and breakout and interactive and all of that. But here we are. But it's just part of trying to do and be church in the middle of a global pandemic. And so thank you for flexing. Thank you for grace and patience as we make hard decisions. But here we are. But tonight's going to look a little different than what they will look like in future months. So this will be a normal cadence in the now rhythm of our church that on the second Wednesday night of every month we'll gather together to discuss theology and practice. That's really important. And even the phrase equip forums are really important. Let me explain why on the offset as a kind of an introductory kickoff to what we hope these will become for the Oaks. So theology and practice, that both of those things are critical because it's not just practices that we need, that theology is what shapes us, that all of our activity must first flow from our identity of like who is God and what is God done and is he doing and will he promises to do in the world. Like that is ultimate and foundational. But when we understand who God is, it does inform who we are. And it changes who we are and how we ought to show up in the world of how we think and what we love and how we live and how all of those things integrate together. So it can't just be practical without understanding theology because that is just behavior modification and it's stapling the roses on the rose bush. There's nothing that real that's going to funnel us or fuel us. It's just pragmatism, just wanting to ask what's effective or efficient or comfortable or what works or trendy or cool or relevant. But we want to be rooted in something much deeper, the story of God and who he is. But adversity is also true, and I think some of us may have grown up in church traditions or around the church where we just focus on theology alone. And that's not a bad thing in and of itself. I don't think that any of us are starving because of or over consuming theology. I think that we need a pretty healthy dose of theology in our lives because we believe wrongly about God, and what we think about God is the most important thing about us. But it also is true that if we just stay in theology and we never connect how that theology applies to real life of your 9-to-5 job or whatever hours you work, or how you raise your kids, or how you try to navigate depression, or how we should be the church together, that it has to be connected and one flows into the other. Even John Calvin, in his opening line of Institutes for Christian Religion, which is his treatise on all things theology, his opening line is, "There is no knowledge of God apart from knowledge of self, and there is no knowledge of self apart from knowledge of God." That they have to go together. If you want to know who you are, you have to know who God is. But if you are really going to know God intimately, then you're going to begin to understand who you are and how you ought to live and reorient all of our lives in line with this revelation. So that's why we say theology and practice. It's teaching us even the way so much of this spiritual formation and following the ways of Jesus works. But second, it's theology and practice equip forums. So it's not just Bible study, although we're going to get in the Word. It's not just like a breakout, although we're going to do some of that. It's not just another Sunday school class, if that means anything to you, if you grew up around that. This is really, really significant for us. It's an equip forum, a forum where we gather together At least that's the idea. But virtually, we are gathering together. So it's a forum, but it's an equipping forum because we really do want to grow in as leaders of the Oaks Church of what does it mean to give practical handles and coaching and equipping to empower you to pursue your calling and what God's enabling you to do as we continue to try to be disciples who make disciple makers, as we try to enjoy Jesus and live for the joy of others. Here's the point. It just doesn't just happen. There used to be equipping, and just to be 100% honest, I don't know that we've done a great job at that. The vision's there, and we're trying to stay simple in how we go about things so that you're freed up to step into all that God has for us as a community. But we just recognize that as we grow into this rooted initiative over the next couple of years, this is something that is significant for us to grow in equipping of how do we do the things that we're called to do. And so I want you to think about this as we present today, but also not just this month, but in the coming months as we address these theological truths and these practices of following the ways of Jesus, to not just apply it to your own life and to do so in community. That's super important, and that's what's going to happen. So we talk about these things, and then on the third week, we multiply off into our communities, and we discuss these theological truths and these practices of praying into these things and coaching one another in these things and asking our honest doubts and questions about these things and getting coaching around how to get unstuck for some obstacles and learning from one another about practically how to apply it. We're going to live this stuff out in community. So we're equipping one another, not just to do another cool, whatever, maybe cool, hopefully cool thing or program of our church, but it's to really to then say, okay, we're going to get down to the ground and we're going to apply it face to face. But not just in applying it to your own life, in community with other people, helping one another, but it really is to say you're called, and I'm called, we are called together to make disciple makers, that what is coming in you must flow through you. So as you're learning to apply things, and we're all learning together, it really is to grow, to say, how do I help other people to grow in their faith? Let's just say somebody right now that's your neighbor or coworker that you're speaking the good news about Jesus with, and you're loving and being hospitable around, praying for to come to know Jesus. And let's just say that they choose, like, hey, I'm ready to follow Jesus. Are we equipped to know some of these basic, big core practices of the Christian life to help so that you are equipped to not just do this yourself, but to help that person grow in these things so that they can take somebody through these things. And so that's the big, big vision of what we're after here. And it's not holistic. We're not going to hit everything this year in Equip Forum. Hopefully this is something that will continue to be a part of our life together. But that's the big, huge why underneath this what. So I want to take some substantial time here on the front end to just explain that, to make sure we're on the same page about that, and to prioritize this as we go. And we would love to hear from you guys as we continue on of what's actually helpful and what are some practices in theology that you want to maybe discuss as we build this out in the future. But that's what we're doing here. But tonight, like I say, it's going to look a lot different because we're not in person. So it's two reasons looking different. So I just know you don't want to be watching me for an hour and a half on a video. And so we're just going to kind of keep it short, sweet, to the point tonight. Very practical. But also the second reason is just in the nature of our church is I'm going to be teaching very similar, very closely tied this Sunday. I'm preaching from Ephesians 4 on spiritual formation and renewal and growth and how we change. And so a lot of the theological work that we would typically do in this is actually going to be addressed in just a few days. So I know you might be watching this after Sunday, but you hopefully can go back and watch that sermon. But in future weeks, it won't tie as closely to the sermon. So it kind of works out well here so that we can kind of get to the point tonight very practically. But I do want to have some theological backing with this. So tonight, the practice, theological and practice that we're talking about, the theology is that you and I were made to abide in Jesus, to remain in Jesus, that we are designed to worship God, to be in awe of Him, to know Him, to practice His presence, to walk in intimacy with him and an awareness of him, to be changed by him in every way. That is the aim of all of this, is to know him and enjoy him. Maybe we could say to enjoy Jesus and live for the joy of others. But what does it mean to abide, to remain? We're going to look at that in John chapter 15. I'd love for you to turn with me. But let's look at John 15 tonight. Give you a minute to get there, just to quiet your heart, even as you watch online, to prepare to just receive the words of Jesus over us. So John 15, verse 1 says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. This is Jesus speaking to his disciples just moments before his crucifixion. Some of the last teachings of Jesus here. It says, every branch in me, in Jesus, that does not bear fruit, that's really important, the Father, the vine dresser, takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, the Father, the vine dresser, prunes, he cuts back, that it may bear more fruit. So we're already seeing a pretty important takeaway. We're intended to bear fruit, right? Verse 3, already you are clean because of the word that I've spoken to you. Literally, that idea of clean is the same word for prune. Already you are cut back. You're pure, you're clean, you're sanctified, you're set apart because of this word that I've spoken. So then Jesus says this beautiful phrase, an invitation over all of our tired, weary, anxious, maybe overly zealous and prideful hearts. He says, I want you to hear the words of Jesus over you tonight. He says, abide in me, and I in you. Abide in me, and I in you. So then he's going to take this metaphor a little further. He says, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, so you imagine yourself as a stick, and you want to have fruit that's filling up the barrenness of who you are, what you are. As a branch cannot bear fruit unless it abides in the vine, unless that branch is connected to something else, to a life source, to something that's has nutrients flowing from it into this otherwise lifeless thing. Neither can you and I produce fruit unless we remain connected or abide in Jesus. So in case we were still confused, Jesus is going to break it down. Verse 5, I am the vine. I am the source of life. You are the sticks. You're just a branch. Whoever abides in me and I in him, there it is again, he it is that bears much fruit. So whether or not we're going to bear fruit or not in our lives is directly connected and correlated with the propensity to which we remain connected to the source of life, which is Jesus. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain connected to the source of our life, which is Jesus, there is zero possibility of producing real, lasting, eternal fruit. Man. If anyone does not abide in me, he's thrown away like a branch and withers. And the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. But if you abide in me, see the if? There's a hinge here. There's a condition here. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you can ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. What a promise as we talk about prayer, try to press into prayer together even more as a church community. By this my Father is glorified. That's the point, is to see God, know God, enjoy God for all that he is. This is how God is glorified, that you bear much fruit. Not just a little bit of fruit, not just trying to survive, but actual flourishing. Produce much fruit. And so prove to be my disciples. So if we say that we're apprenticing with Jesus, it's not just about ideas, and it's not just about trying to show up to church on a Sunday, trying to be more moral, or pass a Jesus quiz, or have certain theological categories, although it is that. But if we actually are saying we're following Jesus, disciples of Jesus, that we're Christians, that there's something deeper here, that to be a Christian means that we are saying right things about Jesus, but that we have so experienced Jesus and are experiencing Jesus to a point where it's changing everything about us, or that we're producing fruit. So if we're not producing fruit, it's saying something about whether or not we actually are following the way of Jesus, because following the way of Jesus is not just ideas, it's a whole different way of being in the world. And that different way of being in the world is not do more, try harder. It's all about grace. It's what God's already done for you. But that we are remaining connected into that source of life. That the struggle is not to be something that we're not. The struggle is not to overcome all the things. The struggle of the Christian life is to remain connected to the source of life, who is Jesus. And he just phrases this to make sure that we aren't just talking about legalism here. He says, by this my Father's, verse 9 rather, as the Father has loved me. So think about the Trinitarian love, divine community, love of the Father to the love of the Son. Just that same way, Jesus says, so have I loved you. I love you in this big, pure, holy love. So he says, abide in my love. Abide in it. Stay connected into this massive reality. It's almost too good to be true that we're caught up in. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, Jesus says, if you obey me, if you guard this way of living that I'm inviting you into, you will abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I've spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. My joy in you, and your joy may be full. So, guys, here's the point. That's stuff that most of us have heard. And if this is new for you, it's exciting, and maybe even just like, how do I even wrap my mind around this? Christianity is not just defined by what I do for Jesus, but by what he's done for me, and he loves me, and he's inviting me into this new way of living. But for most of us, that's probably a little stale, and so I think we just got to first, theologically, just stop and say, praise be to God that Jesus didn't leave us in this hopeless, helpless, sinful state of just being a stick, unable to produce anything that's real, defined by brokenness because we've rebelled against God. But instead, the gospel's true, and he's pursued you. He's pursued me. And he's done for us what we could not do. He obeyed the commandments of God for us. He lived before the Father in love, and he died in our place, and he rose again. And right now he's interceding for us, and he's given us his Spirit to say, I'm producing fruit in you. Real, actual life change that comes from the inside out. Praise be to God for the gospel. It's good news. But I want you to notice here, Jesus is the source of our life. We have to stay connected to Jesus. And this phrase of abiding, of remaining, of making our home in Jesus, is something that we can't just ignore. It's not just some fluffy idea of just abide in Jesus. Like, what does that mean? How do we stay connected? How do we fight this fight? Not to earn God's love, but to believe that we are loved and to remain in this love, and for this love to change everything that we are, to make us into people of love, where we love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's the real question we're asking here. So that's the theology of remaining and making our home in Jesus. Like, that's the point. That's the epicenter. It's beautiful. But if we just stop there and to say, remain in his love, produce much fruit, and we're not taking that command and the invitation seriously to keep his commandments, to produce much fruit as we remain, that the goal is that, and the expectation of Jesus onto us is not to produce fruit. That's not something we can just strive to do, no more than a tree grunts really hard to produce an apple tree or an apple, right? but that it does have to be a tree and remain connected to sources of nutrients and to be rooted, dare I say, in the season of our church, rooted into a source that is life, into the gospel and into the God of the gospel in Jesus. So how do we do that? And so this is the practice that I want us to define us as we are pressing into life together here in January. Going into a new year, how do we remain in Jesus? How do we actually experience the life change that Jesus is promising here? How do we have fullness of joy in the middle of a lot of sad things that's going on right now in our world? How do we be at peace when anxiety is the air that we're breathing in our culture? How do we do it? So here's a practice that I want to introduce to us. It's not the only way to abide and remain, but it's been something that has been the most formative for me, and not just for me, but for Christians of a lot of different traditions and preferences and backgrounds and denominations throughout literally centuries of the church. And it's this. It's called developing a rule of life. Developing a rule of life. And so maybe that is completely new to you, and you're going, I ain't about rules for life. And I want to make a correction there. I did not say rules for life. I said a rule, singular, of life. So not just all these external things, oh my gosh, I got to do all this stuff, legalism, New Year's resolutions, New Year, New You nonsense. That's not what we're saying. But it's a rule for life. Maybe a better understanding of this would be a structure for your life. A structure for your life. So taking Jesus' metaphor a little bit further here of thinking about an actual vine that's producing actual fruit. If that was your job, an arborist or whatever, is that what that's called? Farmer? I don't know. That your job was to help this vine produce fruit. There's a lot of things that are going to happen. You got to prune it. It's going to be watered and seed, has nutrients and all the things. But another thing that is true about a vine, that thing will not produce fruit, even if all those conditions are accurate. It's connected, it's real, it's healthy, all those things. It will be stunted in its growth unless that, if it just lies on the ground, unless that vine is carried along on a trellis or some sort of lattice kind of structure thing. Have you ever seen that with like a vine that's being carried around some lattice? The idea is when it has a structure to hold it up, the vine growth, it produces fruit more healthily and more readily and in more abundance. Without a structure, produces less fruit or might even wilt and die. But with a structure, the structure is not a barrier or a limit. It actually allows for the maximum amount of freedom and effectiveness and fruitfulness and flourishing. A couple of other analogies to maybe think about this. Think about the human body. That your body, your actual literal like flesh and bones, is just that. It's both. That we are made up of blood and tissue and muscles and all of those things that and our brain and the heart and all the organs and all the things that help us to have life. But if there wasn't a skeletal system holding all of that up, we would literally just be a blob of nasty goo, right? It's the skeletal structure that holds up all of the other life organisms. Another example about this, it's a little bit different, but I don't know if you ever heard of the story. I think it was even from a kind of like a psychological survey study thing that happened, where they observed and studied little toddlers on a playground. That they gave one group of kids, on a playground that did not have a fence, one group of kids that had a clear perimeter and a fence around it. And they said, stay within this perimeter, but have fun. And here it was not as well defined. The group A over here, they found stayed very tightly close to the playground, did not really go out into the field where the road where the road was. They were confined to a small geographical spot. No fence, no clear boundary, and they stayed pretty concentrated. However, this group B over here, the second group of kids, where they had a clear fence and a clear parameter, a clear structure, if you will, around it, what they found was the kids actually ran all the way out into the field, all the way up to the fence, not really worrying about the highway and the cars and all of that, because the boundary, the fence, didn't really restrict their freedom, but it actually cultivated freedom, even at a psychological level. It freed them up to go further and take risks, so to speak. And so I think as we think about a rule of life, we can't just think through the lens of legalism, of just all these like things I have to do, or pressure to try to conform to something and be something, and take ourselves way too seriously and all of that. Instead, it's supposed to say, I'm creating space. I'm creating space for the things that matter most, and for my life to actually flourish and produce fruit. For me to actually stay connected to Jesus, who is the source of my life. That's how we have to see this framework. And a rule of life, when lived well and when approached holistically and in community and with a paradigm of grace and thinking holistically, like we're going to talk about, what it actually does is it really does, I think, three things. A rule of life should do three things. Number one, it should align our lives with our deepest desires and conviction. Align our lives with our deepest desires and conviction. I don't know if you've ever felt that way when you look at all of the things that Jesus says that he's invited us into, this vision of the kingdom of God, all of the things that we aspire to in our relationships, all the things that we aspire to with health and the way that we want to grow up in every way that God's called us to, the things that we know, or at least we want to believe that are in the heart of God as we see in the scriptures, this vision of the good life, and our reality. When we compare those two things, if you're anything like me, there's a pretty big gap there. And I think we got to ask the question of, how do we bridge that gap? How do we not lower our expectations and stifle our desires, but to rather say, let's make sure our desires are in line with the things of God, and in so much that they're not, we repent and turn. But once we really say, God, I want your ways, we have to acknowledge that this is not just going to happen. We're not going to just drift into that way of living. And I think so often we get cynical and jaded when God isn't showing up the way we want him to. And we get disillusioned and cynical and depressed, and maybe try to strive and work harder to change, or we give up on people, or whatever it is. But a rule of life is about what are the actual values that I need to be orienting my life around? And is my life actually aligned with it? Is my life actually aligned with it? I think that's the second big idea here of what a rule of life ought to do for us, is it turns ideas into reality. Ideas into reality. This is big for me because I'm a pretty idealistic person. I like to spin it and call it that I'm a visionary, right? I'm a dreamer, strategic planner, whatever. And God has gifted me that way. Ideas come very easy for me. But also I really struggle with follow through. I can start a bunch of stuff. I can motivate you to want to go help me do it. But are we going to live into all that God has for us? This vision that what God's calling us to isn't just going to happen. Annie Dillard writes in one of her books, she says this phrase, she says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. That if we really want to aim at a trajectory, that we are going to look at, are we really pointing our life that way? And once we kind of say, okay, I want to kind of have the North Star and the equilibrium gathered, but then we got to get really practical and say, there's got to be ways of living in the world, step after step after step on this very long journey. That's a lifelong journey of becoming like Jesus, and growth takes time. But growth also is one step at a time. It's this day reoriented around the things that matter the most. It's prioritizing how to abide in Jesus. It's not just going to happen. We will not drift toward these things. So that's really, really significant. And I think there is a way of experiencing transformation as we take Jesus' words seriously. Yes, theologically and experientially, in repentance and faith, and believing rightly that he wants us to remain in him, to make our home in him, that he's done the work, he's producing fruit in us. But also to say, but there's so many things that are vying for our attention. Distractions and pursuits and our own sin, and our own limits and our own weakness, and the cultural waters in which we swim, and distractions on our phone, and all of the things. There's a lot of things that make us not have our home in Jesus. And if we actually want to experience real transformation, I think this is an important paradigm. Eugene Peterson says it like this, that we do not feel our way into new actions. We act our way into new feelings. Say it again. We do not feel our way into new actions. We act our way into new feelings. Meaning, if you're waiting on things to change in you, in a desire level or the worship from God or growth, before you actually obey or press into these things, I think a good example is reading your Bible. It's like, I'm not going to read my Bible if I don't feel it. I'm not going to raise my hand in worship if I don't feel it. I'm not going to share the gospel with somebody if I don't know if I feel it. I don't feel like it. If that's the way we are living, we will always be paralyzed. Or we're just going to go through the motions and burn out and pretend. But there is a different way of being in the world that says, no, I'm going to act my way into new feelings. That I'm going to show up in the ways that God's told me to show up. I'm going to order my life in ways that, with wisdom, from holistic ways to see the world, but also ultimately the way that God has just prescribed life in the Scriptures. And understanding that if I have a rule of my life and I'm putting the big rocks in first, what if my heart will catch up? What if over time things begin to change in me? Because you've probably heard me say this a lot, and I'll say this on Sunday. The things that we do are doing something to us. The things that we do are doing something to us. So you can turn this off and be like, I don't really want to have a rule of life. That's not for me. I'm pretty good, or I think this is weird, or it's too in a box for me, or whatever. But the point is not, will we have a rule of life? It's just, which rule of life will we have? It's not, will you be formed? It's, is the things that we're doing, are the things that we're doing leading us into intimacy and joy and love of Jesus? Or is it taking us away from him? Like the rule of life, you have a rule of life. You have a structure of life. You have an order of life. We can either go about it consciously or unconsciously, but you have one. Something is ordering your days. There's practices and habits in your life that are doing something to you. And this is just a discipline to say we are going to make sure that the things that we're pursuing, these practices, are leading us into all that God has for us. Okay, so that's the big theology introduction to the practice. I just want to say, I'm going to, as this out, we'll put on the website and on the email a resource from a church up in the Pacific Northwest that's developed a very thorough resource on developing a rule of life, like a workbook level that focuses on 7 traits, and it's pretty nuanced and holistic. We'll attach it to this that to really help you to work through it. I really recommend Pete Scazzaro's book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, which gives a lot of theological framework of some of the stuff we're talking about and more. But in the back, it talks a lot about actual practices and how to develop a rule of life and some of the big key practices of the Christian tradition and our faith that should be in all of our rules of life if we want to grow up holistically into Jesus. So that's some future stuff to actually practically take this. We were going to work through some of those exercises if we were here in the room together, but we're not going to do that tonight. But instead, I just want to give you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things very specifically and practically as I wind down here to give you a space to press into in your communities this week. First, as we think about a rule of life, a plan, a structure of how we're going to try to follow Jesus, we have to think holistically. We have to think holistically. You are a holistic being. And so I think often we regulate our spirituality to like explicitly like Christian things of like, okay, when am I going to read my Bible and pray and go to church? It's not less than that. That definitely ought to be a part of it. But God's made you whole, and we're fully integrated as whole beings. You're not just a brain on a stick, so it's not just about learning the right things. You aren't just this disembodied, like Casper the Ghost spirit floating around. You're in a body, and your body matters to God. It's not just a throwaway thing that in the new heavens and new earth, when Jesus makes it all things new, you will be in your body made new, just as Jesus resurrected and had a new body. Your body matters, and so we've got to think holistically. So we do need to think about practices and goals and health and strengths and weaknesses and all those things spiritually. So what are these practices that are orienting my heart toward God? How am I going to pray? How am I going to saturate my mind with Scripture? How am I going to worship and cultivate awe and intimacy? Those are all huge questions. So that's spiritual is an important part of this. But it's not just spiritual. When we think of abiding in Jesus and the rule of life, it's not just spiritual. We have to have those things. So what are they? But also mental. Am I thinking rightly? What are some practices that help me to think differently, to grow and to learn and sharpen and be mature? Emotionally, to listen to your feelings, not to follow your feelings into all the things, follow your heart. That's not what we're saying, but to look inward and to listen to your emotions, as they are a gift from God. God has emotion. He feels. And so are you emotionally healthy? This is where counseling and therapy can come in, but also self-awareness and slowing down and listening to yourself in some ways and speaking truth to yourself. You can't speak the gospel to yourself if you don't really know yourself. So it's really, really significant and emotional. But not just that, but physical. If you're not dieting or sleeping well or drinking enough water or exercising or all of these things, taking care of ourselves, it looks differently for all of us. It has an effect on our soul and actually on our joy and on our relationship with Jesus. We are embodied creatures. And then relationally, we're not just meant to do this in isolation. Community is significant, and the relationships that we have are forming us. So spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, relationally, are you living a life? Do you have a plan to pursue these things? And I would just ask, maybe there's unhealth in one area, and you need to do an audit of your life. I sent that out on our day of rest at the end of December. Go back and grab that. If you don't have it, reach out, and we'll send it to you again. Of like going through all of these areas and saying, where am I pursuing rightly, and I need to keep this up, more of this, and I want to grow here. But man, where's the area that's really deficient for me? And just to be honest, out of all of those categories, for me this year, in this first quarter, my rule of life is deeply tied to relationships. It's something that I have a lot of people around me, and I'm grateful for all of you, but like I want to grow in knowing and being known this year, being present to people. Some of the other areas I've been working on for the last 3 or 4 years, because I think 4 or 5 years ago, I would say I was unhealthy in all of those areas. So think holistically. Don't just think, when am I going to read my Bible? Okay, think holistically. Second, practically, a balance between structure and spontaneity. Structure and spontaneity. Just like what we talked about before is, man, the structure is there to hold up life. It actually gives freedom. And so this is not just about this like big burden that I feel like I have to like always just knock out of the park, and I'm just beating myself up when I don't do it, or I give up 3 months in because it's just too unrealistic or whatever. But structure leads to freedom. Think about like an artist. All of the creativity of art. It actually is very creative and expressive, but but there's some key elements for an author to be, or for an artist to be able to create. They have to play by some of the big rules of like the structure of like, I gotta have a canvas, I need all the art supplies, I need to know how to use those supplies, I need to know how to mix colors, and there's some techniques and ways of showing up that if you really know how to do it, you can create beautiful things and learn skill over time. But the creativity flows out of learning some elements and structures and foundational principles. So I think a lot of times the following the way of Jesus is like that. We've got to learn how, here's a paintbrush, here's some paint, and I've got it and I'm learning it. But then once you have your rule of life, it needs to be broad enough in these big categories enough to say, now these are the containers that the Spirit will fill up. This is allowing me to show up in ways that give me joy, in ways that I really value in life. I'm connecting back to these convictions and values like we talked about on the front end. So structure and spontaneity. If this feels like oppressive rules or whatever, if you're the type A person just going to obsess and freak out about this, like neither one of those are real. It's to say, no, I want to know my supplies, but then allow through the Spirit to create something that's meaningful to me, that may not look anything like it's on this page. This is just the big rocks for prioritization. So think holistic, balance between structure and spontaneity. Third, start where you are. Start where you are, not where you feel you ought to be. You're not going to be Mother Teresa tomorrow because you developed a rule of life tonight, okay? So you got to take an honest assessment of where you're at. Where am I actually? Not where you feel like you ought to be. And these goals they cannot be unrealistic. You need to be being very serious about yourself. This isn't like trying to be spiritual here, especially going into communities next week to try to like just impress everybody. But to be honest, be like, guys, I'm unhealthy physically. And because I'm unhealthy physically, I have health problems right now. Do I have to be gracious to myself that if I have some issue that's limiting me physically, or if you're battling emotional health or depression or anxiety, that's just a part of your story right now. If you are working 3 jobs trying to make ends meet, that's just a part of the season of life that you're in. Can I get a witness for some of the parents up in here that has little kids or older kids to say, bro, silence and solitude and prayer when my kids are just running cray-cray in my house all the time, it's just chaos. Like, so on one level, it's like, no, it's how do we actually still a way to be before the Lord? Let's be intentional, because you're not going to grow if you don't. You can't remain in God's love if you don't. Not the way that you're intended to, but also to be stinking gracious to yourself and honest with yourself about your season of life. It's going to look different than it will when your kids are out of the house, or if you're single, or if there's strengths and weaknesses, there's limitations and opportunities in all of our life, and we just got to get real about it. That's the really big part here. Start where you are, not where you ought to be. I think another thing is look at where you're at in this whole journey of following Jesus. Some of you are checking this thing out or have just become a Christian, or you were out of church for a really long time and you would say, man, I'm unhealthy in all of these things and I'm overwhelmed because I don't know how to do any of this stuff, and it's okay. Like, just like a baby takes steps and learns to walk, it's like no parent is going to like put the kid in timeout because the toddler's like took 1-2 steps and stumbled forward and fell. But no, we like go nuts and take pictures and videos and all the things because there's progress there. Eventually, the kid's going to get up and stand, and he's going to take 5 steps, and he's going to start to walk, and he's going to run, and then they don't stop, right? That's just how it works. And your life with Jesus is that way. And even if you've been following Jesus for a long time, you might be an infant in one of these other holistic categories, and it's okay. Start where you are, come clean, and say, I want to be realistic. So maybe it's, I'm going to actually just read a psalm a day because I've never had consistent Bible reading before. Instead of being like, I'm going to read the Bible in 3 months. Start where you are. Fourth, be specific, not idealistic. Be specific, not idealistic. The rule of life is not just like a treatise of disciple making, of like, this is like this holistic thing that I want to do. It's actually supposed to be a ordering structure for your life. So if it's not specific, then it's not going to help you. So a good example of that is not, I want to rest. That's great. That's part of those big buckets, right? I want to rest. Sabbath is an important thing. We're going to do a theology and practice forum in the summer on Sabbath. Like, God's told us to rest, and He's created this in a rhythm. So how do we practice Sabbath? That's coming up in the summer. So a rule of life is not just, I want to rest, or not even just, I want to do Sabbath, but I'm going to do Sabbath on Friday, from Friday dinner to Saturday dinner. And these are like the 3 or 4 things that I'm going to try to make part of my Sabbath, not just to take a day off, but to reorder my life. It's specific. Like, this is the time frame. This is the measurable action. I know whether I did it or not. I know how to invite other people into it and hold me accountable. I know what to pursue when I get up on Saturday morning, if that's your Sabbath morning. It's about being very, very specific, not vague and fluffy and all of that. And I think it needs to be layered of like, okay, some of these practices need to be daily. Some need to be weekly. Some need to be monthly, quarterly, annually, biannually. You get it. But what are some of the things that are only going to be annual kind of deals, whatever that would be, versus like, just to give you a tangible example from my rule of life with my relationship with Kayla, my wife. Daily, of like, what's our goals daily? Like on my rule of life, it's really said, try to have 15 to 20 minutes of sync up time with my wife every day. We don't always do it. Sometimes I'm out of the house before the family's up, and I have a late night meeting, and we FaceTime together a little bit. But even the FaceTime is like an effort to do that soul sync every day with my wife. Weekly, well, we have family time, and I try to give my wife time away on a Friday when I'm off, and Sabbath day for our family rhythms is like, that's a weekly cadence for our relationship. Monthly on our rule of life is to have a monthly date where the kids are not around and we are with each other, and to be sowing into our relationship in those ways. And I can keep going, but that's just a tangible example of like, that's how specific this needs to get with this relational aspect of this one role that I have as a husband to Kayla. And also, like, just to continue to show up, the whole, like, we act our way into feelings. It's not always going to be great. You're going to miss some of it. Sometimes you're going to be mad at each other, not that it ever happens in our home. And date night doesn't feel like just this fun, exciting thing, but it's like, okay, date night, let's do it. Let's make it a priority. But the point is when we don't do it, if we go 2 or 3 weeks without the daily sync up, I can tell it in our relationship. I'm a lot sharper with her. We're just withdrawn. We can feel out of whack. We're pretty structured people, and if we don't sync up with our schedules and all that, it's just a mess. But it doesn't always feel life-changing when we're having the 15 or 20-minute soul sync. It sometimes feels like we just have to do this. But over time, what that does to change us, to change our marriage, to deepen our marriage, and when we don't have it, how we feel it. Okay, last but not least, balance between upstream and downstream practices. Balance between upstream and downstream practices. Here's what I mean by that. Think actually about a river. You got a current that's flowing downstream. If you hop in the river on an inner tube and you go downstream, it is just fun. Have you ever been like tubing or whatever on a river? Whitewater rafting or whatever, going downstream is exhilarating, and it's natural, and it's easy, and it's life-giving. But if you try to swim up the stream, it takes some work, right? It takes effort, and it's hard, and it's not natural, and it's slower, all those things. And I think when we talk about following Jesus, if we're going to do it healthily and do it in a way that lasts for a really long time, so we don't give up, and we really are remaining in Jesus' love for us, it needs to be both. It needs to be both. So I think sometimes when we think spiritual disciplines, we almost always just think about upstream. It ought to feel like strenuous work. And man, because it is, I've quit. And I feel guilty about it. And that's just what following Jesus is, man. It's just discipline and grit. And it is discipline and grit. We're talking about that. Just like you're not going to get awesome biceps by doing one set of curls. You got to keep ripping the muscles and keep showing up over time, over a long time, to see any results. It is that. So you have to have some upstream stuff. But also, man, following Jesus can be downstream as well. And I think sometimes we put pressure on ourselves if we've just done spiritual disciplines that feel upstream. There might be a lot of reasons for that. But sometimes it's because maybe there's an absence of some really downstream life-giving practices to us. And then when you discover those, it can change everything. So here's a good example for me. Prayer. I want to grow in prayer. Prayer was always hard. I'd get distracted. I hated it. Going through a little list, too strategic and full of myself and busy to make time for it. How do I pray? Well, I found a downstream practice for me, specifically about prayer, is to walk. I know that might sound weird to you, but it is. So if I'm here in a prayer room right now in the office, and even when I'm praying in isolation, or if you come and pray with us in the prayer room, I pace because I think because I'm an embodied person, it does something to me. Or if I'm doing a late night prayer walk with the dog, walking around, or early morning and being up with the sunrise, there's something about that practice that allows me to not be so distracted. It cultivates beauty in me, and it helps me to see and experience God in a lot of other spaces. It allows me to, I think, listen to the Spirit, to be focused on even a prayer list and intentionality. That one discovery of going, okay, that's a downstream practice. I could keep trying to fit prayer in ways that wasn't working. But man, when I found a downstream practice, it made prayer come alive to where now I've grown in prayer to where I would say, man, prayer is something that's beautiful for me. I don't do it like I want to, but it actually is something that I feel like is flowing from a real place in me now. But I've acted my way into a feeling about that. It's like an acquired taste for coffee or whatever. It's like you first try, it's like, I don't know. Deep down, after a while, you begin to love it. After you do some creamer, and then you work your way into you're a coffee snob or whatever. And I think practices can be like that. So what are some downstream practices for you? Think in those holistic categories. What's downstream? What is life-giving? You need to make that list, and you need to prioritize it. But also, it's what are the upstream practices that I really need? To really grow, I got to be able to go against the grain. The things that maybe be the hardest for you, you don't need to give up with. Like Derek said, life-giving practices, and generosity isn't life-giving, so I'm not going to do it. It's like, well, no, actually, generosity and doing so in a way that's maybe nobody knows about, that's sacrificial and hurts, is the best thing for your soul to grow. It's the working out kind of thing for your soul to grow. So what are the upstream practices for you? For me, here's a good example, for one, is cultivating gratitude. Even just learning my personality and the way that God's hardwired me and my false self that I portray to the world, my Enneagram, right? I'm a 4-wing 3, if anybody's curious. We can talk about the cult if you like. But part of being a 4, so to speak, in Enneagram, I know some of you are going to hate that I'm alluding to the Enneagram, but part of my personality is melancholy, fixating on what's not there, kind of sad and cynical. And so one of the most upstream things for me is to slow down and not just focus on what's not there, but what is there. Not just don't focus on what God's not done, but what has He done? Where was He in my life today? Not just all the sad things that happened or the things that I didn't get to and the shame that I feel that I'm not enough, but to actually just say, a key practice for me is cultivating gratitude. I do it every night before I go to bed in my journal. I do a big list every Sabbath day. I'm cultivating gratitude. God, it's little stuff, it's big stuff, but I'm looking for evidences of God and making my heart be grateful. And there's not a time that goes by that I don't fill up a list, and not a time that goes by that something doesn't pivot in my soul. What is that for you? Well, what are some of those upstream practices that, man, it ain't easy, but it's what I need the most? Okay, I've talked a lot. I said that I was going to be shorter. I don't even know how long this has been, but here we are. It's going to be an hour and a half, and I know that's not been it. It was going to be an hour and a half in person. I know we didn't go an hour and a half at least. So thanks for enduring up to this point. But I really would invite you to take some time away. So if you're married with kids, spouse, listen to me. Give your spouse time to go to a coffee shop or walk around, go to the park, or lock yourself in the room or whatever. Just spend some real time working through the workbook, filling some things out for your own self. And you don't have to fit in some box. There's no right or wrong way to do this. The point is, Jesus is inviting you to abide in Him, and He in you, to make your home in Him. And the fundamental epicenter of our faith in the gospel is that we have been made one with Jesus. We are united to Jesus. And it's beautiful. And there's nothing that we do or don't do. You can do it in real life or not do it in real life. And it doesn't make God love you more or less. That's not the point of this. But it's to say, this is who I am positionally. I'm one with Jesus. But man, I want to experience that union. You can be married legally. But man, there's a difference between I'm legally married in the courts and I'm wearing a ring to like actually pursuing someone. holistically for a lifetime. And that's what we're talking about here. Of what are the things that help us to stay tethered to the source of our life, who is Jesus. Not to get things from him, not to even have a better, happier life, although that's a residual effect, but to get God, to know God. So that's what it's about, developing a rule of life, and that's what I'm praying for our church here in January. So let's continue the conversation. There'll be a guide and resources for you that'll go out with some questions as you go into next week's Oaks community time. So take those seriously, be thinking about them, go in ready to chat and help each other. Let's sharpen each other. We have different gifts, different personalities. Some of us, we do our version of this, and we can help others and all those things. And so I'm excited to see what God does as we press into this together. All right. I love you guys. Hey, we couldn't be here in person, but thanks for watching.